My name is Ando, and I'm an artist, a photographer, and a member of the Undergang. Every week, I sit down with an artist, a curator, a musician, an author, or anyone else working in the creative fields, and we talk about their work, their life, and what it takes to keep fighting the good fight in our world today. Welcome to the Undergang Armchair. Hey guys, welcome back. Episode 22. Here we go. Springtime edition. How you guys doing? It's a good day. It's warm out there. We think that spring is here, and we choose to think this, even though every year in Copenhagen it turns around and bites us right on the ass. But the weather's nice right now. We're taking it. We're running with it. Before I forget, I want to give a shout out. We got our first listener mail, which is pretty exciting. And even better than that, it was someone who likes the show. So, hooray! So shout out to Heidi Hove, or Hove, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but shout outs to her. Thanks for writing us. I have been listening to podcasts all day long. So check this out. An economist went to Africa, had a bucket and a tennis ball, and had this thing where, just ask people from the Maasai tribe in Tanzania, which is a very patriarchal society, to throw this tennis ball in the bucket. And every time they got it in there, they got $1. Or they could choose to, every time they make it in, they get $3, but they have to compete against somebody else. So as long as they did better than the other person, they got the $3 per bucket, or they got nothing. So, essentially a gambling maneuver. So they did this in order to find out who chose what, and about 50% of men chose to gamble. $3 per bucket, and only about 25% of women choose to gamble. Alright, so infer from that what you may. But then they went to northern India. I think they're called the Nuri. I didn't catch it. A tribe, very matriarchal, one of the only true matriarchies in the world where women really do run the show. And they did the same thing. And what did they find out? About 50% of women chose to gamble, and about 25% of men chose to gamble. That's pretty interesting. So, what that shows is that essentially culture gives us gender roles, right? That it's not genetic. Now, where do I know this from? I was listening to a great podcast called Freakonomics. You may have heard about the book. It was a big hit, but they have a show once a week. And I strongly recommend it. It's a really interesting show. It's a group of economists who essentially apply their craft to real-world problems, not necessarily problems that have to do with money. And I tell you, it's really interesting. The episode was about differences between women and men. They had one about bitcoins. They've got ones about marriage. There's all sorts of really interesting ones. And I say that to you guys because I want to spread the podcast love. I want to get everybody listening to podcasts. This one, other ones, all of them. By the way, we've also been getting a lot of questions about how to listen to the show. You guys don't have to stream it from the website. In fact, that's probably the worst way to listen. So just so you know, it's easier if you have an iDevice to get it via iTunes and subscribe, or download it straight from the website and then listen to it at your leisure instead of streaming it. I think we'll put a link up on the website explaining a little bit about this in the next week or so. So just in case you were curious about that. You guys ever meet somebody where you had a plan to talk to them about something, and then they just happen to be so interesting and engaged and know so many things that you barely got around to talking about what you were supposed to talk about? That would be this week's guest. That would be Asbjørn Skou. Him and I hit it off really well. We talk really well together. He's an encyclopedia of interesting ideas, thoughts, processes. The guy is so engaged on so many levels. He's just fascinating to talk to. So I could barely keep it together and remember to ask him about where he comes from and about his work. But it's a really interesting talk, thanks to him, really. So he has a show right now at Third Space Gallery. It's nearing the end. It's only up until the 5th, so this is the last chance to go see it. I would go check it out if I were you guys. It's a really good one. And, it fits in really well with this talk. So you can listen to this and then go see the show before it closes on the 5th. And what else? I just need to make a small correction. In the show, about 12 minutes in, I talk about a small island north of Copenhagen. I mean in the north of Denmark. It's not north of Copenhagen. It's way out there. Just so you guys know. All right, that's it. Please enjoy the talk with Asbjørn Skou.
Back then I was doing these sort of intervention thing in the street where I was using DSLI projectors to work with different imagery in the city, and then have these mobile DSLI projectors and going around for a limited time, then projecting stuff onto architecture. And she was then out with me for a night in Vesterbro where we were just trying things out, different spaces. And then that was turned into a short film.
Okay.
So I think the name is mainly just a spin-off of that, and then I mean, there is the whole discussion of third space theory. I don't know if you know that. There's like...
Is that science or is that art?
It's a kind of social science term. I can't remember the name of the guy who coined it, but I think he was an American sociologist. But I first encountered it in terms of Edward Sawyer, who's sort of like urban planning theory grand old man. He written this one book called Post Metropolis, which is a brick, like, in terms of urban planning theory.
Right.
And he's discussing this thing with, like, you have first space, second space, third space, and first space being like the place where you live in, and second space being your space of work, and third space then being sort of this... the place where you find recreation, but which is not necessarily a commercial setting. It can be a commercial setting, but it's a place that sort of accommodates that conversations happen, or that social interaction happen. So
that everything from a cafe to a
the
art
benches
space
down here to like, and to sort of divide it in, to give that a name, that it's like outside of our professional zone or a personal zone, but it's in this weird space that crosses over.
You almost say cultural space of any sort.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, I've heard also from Jacob that you're very theoretical. You're really interested in reading books and doing and engaging on that level. Mm-hmm. Have you always been that way? I mean, have you always just kind of been interested in knowledge and reading? And
I come from a family that's like largely from an academic background, and so that. You have a term in Danish where you say like you're academically damaged. So it's like
wait, what is it in Danish?
Akademikerskadet. So
that's hilarious.
But my dad studied history and anthropology for something like 18 years, but he's working in Lundtoftegade, managing backyards in this social project, housing project.
Did he get tired of...
He got tired of academia. He didn't come from an academic background himself, and I think he had a hard time being in that structure of it and figuring out where to go with that. But that meant that he was always reading a lot. My mother is an architect and works with urban planning. So it's kind of interesting that I end up working a lot, like, artistically, but in that cross field with those things that is somewhere between, like, history.
Right, because you definitely work with anthropology, human space, architecture, urban planning, that whole thing. But I mean, it makes sense. My mom's a psychologist, and people are always like, "Oh."
That's always when people come with that thing. Like, my mom was a psychologist. You always go, "Yes, okay, now we know this."
Well, on the other hand, my dad was a carpenter, so I kind of get both sides. But I think, I've always kind of wished I was academic in a way, but I also have a really hard time existing in that format. I mean, I went to art school. Mm-hmm. I know those people. Yeah. There is that group which tackle art really more from an academic end than any sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say physical, but trade. They're not learning a skill with their hands. Mm-hmm. They're learning a skill with their minds. And that's, essentially what academia is.
Yeah. But I think there is this discussion where, and by now intellectual has in some circles become like kind of a curse word, but there is the difference between like academia and intellectual, because academia is the sort of the trained intellectual format where you say, okay, there is a form to this that you have to fulfill for it to be proper academia, and that also makes for a rigid skeleton. Like that's the university format, the proper scientific article format with all the structures that it has. And there I think that's interesting coming from an artist perspective where you work equally with your head and with your hands. And by now, of course, we are in this place where there's created this major rift between like the artist and the craftsman, which is something relatively new historically that happens. But you're still in this field where you can negotiate the rigid structures of academia. Because
and then throw it away if you want.
Exactly. Too. But I think there's a strength in knowing how it functions, particularly when working with, in my case, primarily with images, but where there is always a lot of like research and text connected to that production of images.
Right, your show now is essentially based off of one book, right?
Yeah, of a novel actually, not even a book. And there's also text directly in this exhibition, which is something kind of new. But also in those terms that like that this with actually producing writing, which is not then thought of as in context of an exhibition, but continuously producing writing. For example, like a guy like Asbjørn, for example,
right?
Somehow also a failed archaeologist and was really interested in
Was
that.
he?
Yeah, and he written so much, and it becomes kind of a problem because then you have art historians that are trying to say like, okay, but this means that and that, and then you suddenly have all this writing that circumvents that, because the artist as a writing factor can do something to the position that the critics and the historians put themselves in.
Right.
And a lot of the stuff he produced was also relatively gibberishy, but
right. But well, I mean, it's like Jasper Johns, you know, he would people would write long treatises on his works, and he'd go, no. I mean, I appreciate that. That's part of it. That's cool. But no, that's not at all what I was thinking, you know? And that's great, you know, because he accepted then that was a part of presenting work. You know, he wasn't like, you're wrong, go fuck yourself. He was like, you're wrong, but that's cool. Yeah. You know, go ahead, really. Yeah. Like, that's fine.
But I think that's also the interesting part in seeing art as a sort of a valid production of knowledge in society, as not just an entertainment or commodity factor, but something that's just along the lines of like this would be called like grundforskning or base science.
Base research.
Oh shit. What is it called again in English?
I guess I would say base research or ground research.
Ground research, exactly. But in a field where everything is much more negotiable, and where everything, as you say with the John's example, it can be questioned and said like, oh, could be this or this way, but it could also be seen as this other way, and that's difficult whenever we talk about science, because it's exactly the opposite of everything that science is.
Right, attempting
nature science is, in that sense of saying that we have one fixed answer and we can work towards that, and it's usually a mathematical equation that we can test it with.
Right. I mean, this is great. We're going straight into it. I struggle. I'm constantly kind of like, why art? Why, like, what function does it really serve? I really run the fence upon being like, you know, art is because we have to. Mm-hmm. You know, essentially humans have always made art. There's no, you know, one of the quotes I like is art serves to create what life doesn't. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a very simple idea that like, well, we don't need to ask why, because it is. And being like, well, I could probably go do social work, you know, or even more like I could use art to engage with children to help them, you know, like there's so many ways where it's just like, okay, make art, put on wall, hopefully expensive, fancy thing gobbles it up. Yeah. Keep, you know, repeat, you know, and that kind of closed money system, which, you know, everyone bemoans the art world and what a shit show it is, but any industry is a shit show. Yeah. you know, if you look at like the meat industry, it's no better, you know. So like then we'd have to engage on like, why am I buying chicken? You know, where did this come from? You know, everything is fucked if you want to look at it that way. But this is kind of that whole thing I have, like, why art? Why, you know, we have brains, we have hands.
Yeah.
We're capable. Why?
I think to engage with that question, first have to sort of see, like, how do we look at art in society? And I should say, like, we very often, even within the art world, we're very, like, we're struggling with this commodity factor that we're constantly, we're producing culture, which is also just a form of commodity, one other type of, like, capital. And, and we're constantly validating what we do towards the idea of the more official system with that somewhere along the lines it creates actual capital, that even the immaterial capital I'm creating by doing cultural stuff 2 steps further will create cash in hand or a working place for somebody else, and that's my function in society, and therefore it needs to be supported by the official channels. And I feel, at least in my generation, it's very often that people, whenever they say I'm doing art, there's these connotation marks around the art, sort of that we feel it's a little bit embarrassing to say art, because, as you say, it would make so much more sense to go do social work, or even make a chair, like something you can use for something that serves a practical and very direct purpose.
Right.
And I think that's sort of, it's a bad way to go about it, because I think that this perhaps romantic idea is that, but also I think very valid idea, that art is necessary. Like, art can change things. Art is something that we both have to do, but it's also a thing that is, like, not imagine a society without art.
Right.
Like, it'd least be a very scary place, or where
and
the art
as soon as you remove art, you remove so many other things. It's like, okay, well, I don't like the gallery system. Let's remove that. Well, you know, maybe music will disappear then too.
Yeah.
No one questions music. No one ever is like, why music? You know, and that's a fucked up industry too.
Yeah.
You may discuss that.
Yeah, but it's less direct in that sense of seeing, like, okay, there's this very fixed point or geographical location where you can see, oh, that and that works that and that way, and because of the thing, like a very big record company, you know, we were just talking about Sony before, it becomes way more sort of fluctuating, difficult to figure out, like, when we have this, okay, we consume music at a different level that we consume exhibitions, for example, but basically it's the same, like.
Right, and I think it's also interesting that art kind of constantly has to question itself. In a bad way. I mean, I think questioning yourself is a good thing in a lot of ways. But the idea that you have to justify. Constantly.
To yourself and to your fellow artists.
Right, I mean, how many jobs constantly has to be like, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
You know?
And if you're doing road works, it's very apparent, like, okay, of course, we need to fix the hole in this road. And, but
I need a job. I need the money to survive. And you need a road.
Yeah.
So, I mean, okay. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. Where did you grow up? Where did you come from?
I come from Nørrebro.
Okay, so you are a Copenhagener.
Yeah.
I keep telling people no one comes from Copenhagen.
No, because
but people do.
They have to, but I figure out that a lot of the people that I meet, they come from the islands or from the mainland, and they move over here. But somebody has to grow up here and then move somewhere else, I figure.
Right. Well, there's a few on Læsø, on that island in northern Copenhagen. There's a couple of dudes who grew up in Copenhagen and are like, that is the worst place on earth. I would never, you know, like, I don't, you know, and I think what happened was I got involved in some shit. You know, and I keep telling them, like, one of these guys, he's like, I would never live in Copenhagen because, well, wait, you can't ask me to sell heroin to a kid. You know, and I'm like, no one's ever asked me to sell heroin to a kid. You know, like, I don't have to do that by living in Copenhagen. You know? I think there were some steps along the way which led to that. You know, but yeah, you're right. Essentially, you know, some people grew up here, but the city wasn't at that point. Like, people moved out of the city.
I had to escape as well. Like, I went to Germany and I lived there for 6 years. Under the guise of studying at an art academy.
The guise of art school.
But also to get out, and that was really the right time because of having a break from being involved in one certain specific environment and moving in one specific direction, and this with moving yourself geographically was so important to get new eyes on the city, to figure out, like, why is it I find that this is an interesting place to be based in.
Right. What was it like when you grew up here? I mean, I mean, of course, it was your world, you know, and that's what you knew. So, I don't know. It's just strange to me because so many people come here from away. You know, if you look at it like maybe their parents grew up here, they moved, they were like, finally we saved enough money to buy a house, we're moving to the country, and then their kids grow up and go, I fucking hate the country, I'm going back to the city, you know, and I don't know, did you feel like at a certain point, you must have realized that you were in like a certain position in a country that has only one large city, you know, as being a city boy.
That's exactly the thing that I'm thinking is also the odd part about it, is that we have to move back to the city because there's only actually one to really talk about, which also means that Copenhagen becomes this bizarre nexus point in this such a small country with a city that's proportionally like dysfunctionally large for the fact that there's only like 5.2 million people living in the entire place.
Right, and tiny compared to world cities.
Completely. And it will never be a metropolis. It will always just be a big town in that sense. And it has some of these like metropole qualities to it in a sense, but they're all like in miniature scale.
Right.
Which I also find it's interesting because it's an interesting like sort of experimental ground to see, okay, what will happen, and then a thing that you will see in an entire neighborhood you can sort of see represented by a block or street or, for example, a discussion of gentrification, which is I think unavoidable topic when we're talking about Copenhagen during the last 10-20 years. Then this was seeing one street as representational for a whole set of problems around gentrification, where going to Berlin we have to sort of scale it up and say like, okay, this is some blocks or a neighborhood, but here it's only taking place in Jespergade, which is like not even 200 meters long. Right.
One axis there. Yeah, no, you're right. And that's one of the things I love, because Copenhagen is a lot bigger than it should be, like culturally, educationally, because it's the capital. It's what you got here to center things in, you know. So the city, like a city this size in the U.S. is, I don't know, let's take a shot in the dark, Raleigh, North Carolina. You know,
I don't even know where that is.
Exactly. You know, but this is Copenhagen. This is the capital of the country. This is where the government is. This is where education, business, all this stuff happens. And so you get big city, small city simultaneously. I mean, I love the fact that I bike 10 minutes to work every day. Yeah. I live in essentially the center of city right here. You know, all these things would be impossible in Milan. They'd be impossible in New York. They'd be impossible in San Francisco even, you know, at least for me.
I think that you then, like, people tend to then to find smaller perimeters for community within the larger cities. Then you move about like in different ways, but you don't maybe not traverse so much space. You still have your block where you belong, or your neighborhood, or your area, and then you can go a month without leaving Neukölln, or you can stay in Silver Lake for like so and so much duration of time. You buy your coffee over in that corner. Because these like humongous cities, like for example we're discussing Los Angeles now, that like become too big to even comprehend or to live in any way. They have to find an area still, like
you're part of the city. Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, I lived in Chicago for 3 or 4 years, and Chicago's a great city. It's also absolutely enormous. You know, and there's parts, it's a very segregated city. North is essentially white people with a couple of pockets. West is black and Latino. South is black. It's a very gross generalization, but that's essentially correct. I don't think I know anything about the south side of Chicago. I've barely been there. I've gone through a couple of times, and it wasn't like, oh my God, there's black people. It's like, I don't know anyone who lives there. I don't know any institutions down there. I don't know, and I've never even been invited there, you know. The whole thing was just kind of like, there's this area which I don't go to because I've got no relation to it whatsoever. There's an airport. I went to the airport sometimes, you know. And there was low income and high income in the north. You know, you could negotiate that city living only in the north. Just engage on that level, you know, which was fascinating. In Copenhagen, you can't do that. It's not segregated to that level, you know.
No, then you need to go at least to the outskirts. Right. There's places that never come in. No, further out, like still, because then there's these miniature towns like Brøndshøj or
Tingbjerg.
Tingbjerg is an interesting example because it was built to be very sort of, it's like architecturally quite interesting, and it was built to be a very functional community, but it's a dead end.
Right.
Geographically, you can only go into Tingbjerg, you cannot leave again, and it's not really connected in any way, so it becomes a satellite within the city.
Right.
And it's extremely central, but at the same time you completely enter the suburbs there.
Right.
And then it ends up being a social dumping ground.
Right.
Which also then turns it into like ghetto, and
right.
and a very like an efficient ghetto because of it being sort of segregated geographically.
Right.
It's more difficult to have a ghetto area right here around, like, for example, Blågårds Plads, where...
Right, because there's all sorts of people who live here.
Yeah, and this sort of the social housing projects are then sort of integrated next to functional andelsboligforening and stuff like that, and they bleed over into each other. And I think that the trick with when you get the segregation is if you suddenly, when a part of the city goes from being a question of practical accommodation for citizens to being like a social project in that sense. For example, Lundtoftegade as well, that shifted that whole stream of blocks that's up there, which is really problematic today.
Where is that?
It's up by Bispeengbuen.
Okay, yeah, okay.
You have these high rises up there,
right.
Where originally when they were built, they were taking like the piss poor workers from inner city that was living in number 6 backyard and fire traps with toilets in the backyard and really...
Right, my backyard used to be a building.
Stuff like this, and there used to be several backyards behind here. Right. Like, and they were taking them and then they were moving them out there, and they were moving them to, for example, Høje-Taastrup.
Right, Ishøj.
Yeah, these places that was built, also planned at once and then constructed, and which was at the time a good idea again in a sort of social democratic sense, saying, okay, here you have all the houses are very democratic, they look like each other, you get the same space, you get toilets in the apartments, you get thermo windows, you get functional kitchens, here is your train station, here's your green area, here is your shopping possibilities, here's your kindergarten, and for a while people were actually wanted to move there because they came from 6th backyard.
Right, and they had no sunlight at all.
Exactly, but then the class positions shift with immigration, and somebody becomes the new bottom,
right.
And they didn't get put in there because they have nothing else to do, and we don't know what to do with them, and they come with a completely different set of problems, and then suddenly the piss poor Danish or white workers didn't want to live in Lundtoftegade, and then they were putting in the new underclass of people, and then it suddenly becomes a social project, and then it starts shifting its identity and become...
Did you grow up during this change? I mean, did you see this happening when you were young?
Yeah, I don't know how aware I was of it. I mean, we've been seeing it happening in Nørrebro, like in the years, because Nørrebro in the 80s were way different. And
it's much more raw, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, how did you use the city as a young person?
Used it quite a lot, but it was also relatively localized. Like, my mother moved to outer Østerbro when I was 7 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it was going to school somewhere between that, here and there, and going a lot back and forth in a certain system, back and forth between there.
Right.
But in those years, for example, I was never in Amager. I hardly knew anybody who lived in Amager, and so I wouldn't go over that bridge, but I would go to Christianshavn and have a relation to that space. Or so again, this you can see the exactly, and then I got involved in the sort of punk activist DIY left-wing environment.
Which is definitely Nørrebro based.
Yeah, there was again this affiliation to Christiania, of course, but it was very Nørrebro based. So then you would very much be around here, and you'd use the city a lot because a lot of the activities that we somehow were involved in had to do with using public space in various ways. But it was very centered here because everybody was living here, and later in the start of Nordvest, people started moving further out there.
And I guess you went to the old youth house before God tore it down.
Yeah, I was an activist there for a lot of years, but then up until the point where I moved in 2003, and then I didn't make a split with it, but then I was located in Germany for those 6 years. So.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a whole other bag of worms, that community of people, you know. I support them with my heart, but not with my brain. You know, I just think I believe in a lot of their ideals, but I think they go about reaching them so poorly in so many ways. They're so bad at engaging the rest of the world, you know.
It's definitely like some analytical tools that the general Danish left wing has lost along the ways of like a general critique of the system, or an analysis of where we're at, which is not as much translated into that. But on the other hand, in that environment being like so unpedagogical and so like this excluded utopian experiment sort of within society, like this whole idea of an autonomous thing that exists within another system but sort of semi-independently of this system.
Right, and they're supposed to be really open. They're the ones who understand, and they're the ones who are accepting of all types of people, but they're not really.
No, but I also think that like during the years, because that would be a lot of my critique of it as well, and you'd often end, when you're part of that environment, you often end up, whenever you're talking with people who are also part of that environment, you have this like never-ending list of critique points of why it doesn't function, and whenever you then go out into the other parts of society, then you always end up defending it.
Right.
And you cannot, like, and I think it's very important to land somewhere in between, because I learned some really, really valuable things in being in an environment that was so much like hell to leather. Just
right.
A complete explosion of everything, and a creative explosion.
Right.
And with a lot of like self-implosion involved and really destructive tendencies, but still looking at a European sort of radical left-wing environment, then the Danish has been a very conscious, this whole activist tradition that we have in Denmark.
Right.
And for example, a very good tradition that was inherited from perhaps like the hippie activist, not the complete hippie, but the hippie activist culture of this, with like a complete ban on hard drugs, which like would just go to places like Spain or Poland and be very integrated, that if you're punk rock, you're also into speed or heroin or whatever. And that was complete ban here. And people were always quite impressed with, when you would come somewhere else, they would be like, you look like punks, but you're all activists.
Right.
Which was just a couple of generations before there was a bigger segregation between like the squatters and the activists and the punks. And that sort of merged within that one tiny place of the youth house where...
But that's that Danish thing, right? We don't like drugs, but we sure drink a lot.
We do. And people are fucking themselves and each other up in so many other ways.
Right.
And it was also an environment that attracted like people who were in a permanent state of crisis and on a very existential level. And then this whole idea of trying to exist outside society is so hard. And it's so hard on the community that you don't have to form.
Well, I guess it can never solidify because of its nature.
No.
And that's why people also kind of end up dropping out. You know, there's a kind of an age range where it seems to be centered.
That was interesting to see in context of moving to Germany, where people enter that environment much later, but they also stick around much later. Like here, I got in when I was 13 or something. And a lot of people did. But then when they're 25, they need to bail. Like,
you just can't keep living like that, right?
No, but I think that if we turn the whole thing around and say, like, isn't a very large problem with society in general is that we have this idea that it should solidify to be stable somehow, because like society is never stable, and the points when it is stable, it has the problem of becoming like repressive, and all the points when it can actually positively exist is when it is in a state of flux, when it is constantly being negotiated and changed. And that's also difficult points, because it's like when you take a step, then your one foot will be in the air and you will be out of balance. But I think that the moment that you imagine a society, or like an idea of society that has both feet on the ground and is like solidified in one place, it's also a scary place,
right?
Because that's where all the rigidity and the rules and the doctrines and we do it this way and not that way, comes into play.
Well, that's where my heart goes out to them, because I understand, like, I'm on the essential plan of like, we're being fucked every day of our lives by so many forces, you know. So why not fight all you can, tooth and nail, you know? But for me, like, I partied a lot in my 20s, like a lot of people did, and I was slipping away. You know, I never got involved in anything really gnarly or anything, but what I got involved in was not, I missed having control over my life to do other things, I guess. You know, I didn't make any art really during that period. I started very early being like, I want to be an artist. I'm going to do this. No, you know. And then for like, from like 20 till 25, when I was in art school even, I barely made anything because I was too occupied with that explosion of life and like people, parties, shit's happening. I'm full of feelings, you know, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I had to, you know, if I hadn't stepped out, I'd still be there. And it is fundamentally a depressed place for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But, and that's the question, but isn't like any sort of late teen years like a sort of depressing place to look back on, and a glorious place as well, because everything is fucked up, right, and you're feeling stuff with such intensity that you never live again, because there's so many things that are new,
right?
And you have to learn everything all the time. It's really hard, and you're really existential, and you're really exposed, and
you're raw and open,
and you make so many mistakes, and it's like and your mistakes feel so much more heavy than they would do now, and
well, okay, let's. did this? You said you started pretty early, like 13 years old in this environment. Did this push you into being, quote unquote, an artist, to being creative? I mean, is that kind of where it started?
It totally did. I think the thing with art is that when the question of we're talking about art, or we're talking about professional art, or we're talking about like where that divider lies, and that is really difficult discussion. I'm not sure I want to get into.
No, I think I mean your own, whatever it is.
My own sort of path in that is like we all start drawing and painting at the same time. It's a question of when we stop. And drawing and painting in our society is very much connected to this idea of play. And as soon as we hit our teens, it becomes sort of unfashionable to play. Then we should be into other things. At least this direct extension between the childish play and then the creation of like creative or what do you say, like endeavors, something you do creatively. And first there was graffiti and hip hop, which sort of gave that like idea of producing something visual a function again. It was still a direct extension of play, but it served a function within a social system of saying like, I'm into this, therefore I'm doing these things.
Right.
And then after that, like the activist punk culture again gave it another function, because it was suddenly. First of all, it was an environment where it was like everybody was playing in bands, everybody was making scenes, everybody was like, even though how piss poor they were at doing anything, they were doing it.
Right.
And that was the beautiful thing about
the creative energies.
So people were like, oh, you can draw, sure, you're gonna make posters or banners or scenes or whatever, like do something. And that sort of energy around it, or getting a direction in it to say, okay, this is, I'm validifying the playfulness of this, of saying the play serves a function in this community.
Right, and the beginning of exhibition, the idea of exhibition. Like, I make this, and now people engage with it.
Exactly, and it can be used for something where you engage somebody who's outside of your immediate surroundings. Like, just having space to do that, having the space to say, okay, I'm gonna paint this wall. I'm just gonna make a really big drawing on this wall, and asking somebody, and I'm gonna, yeah, sure, do that if you feel like it. It's very rare that we get those opportunities to sort of think outside of the box of what our like creative perimeter can do. And a lot of the things that we were sort of engaged in as well they were based on these activist ideas, but I mean they had all these performative qualities and doing these weird actions where we would dress up and have street theater elements, but it would be happening while we were hijacking a meeting in the city hall and dressed up as Ghostbusters, trying to
play and fun is always engaged in that sort of like social disobedience and
but it's very serious kind of play and fun, and I think that's a part of the dysfunction of a society is also just saying that we cannot have like play and fun cannot be serious. It's put over in another box. Like even when we were talking about art before, like we're validifying by being a commodity or by creating commodities, not just for the fact of making things or doing stuff.
What did it? I mean, so you got your start there. Did going to Germany, was that like kind of a change? Like, did you hit a wall? Were you like, I'm done here. I can't. It's no longer exciting. Or I'm partying too much. Or you said you had to hit the eject button.
I hit a wall more, perhaps like personally, in terms of feeling like the teen existential crisis of of only seeing bleak, and also because it is a hard environment to be in, because you're very much focused on what's wrong with the world. You're very focused on being anti,
right?
And even though there is utopian qualities in that environment, it's very much about like being against, and that was a hard like mental space to constantly be in. And I was very, very good at sort of figuring out, visualizing what was wrong with the world,
and just being angry and kind of unhappy constantly.
I needed to go somewhere where I could do some other things, and then I started trying to seek that out within Copenhagen, like starting in a different art school here, in a different form of education, and doing other things that was slightly related to the environment, but not as much directly in that activist sense.
So did you see your next step as being art? Like you started drawing more?
At that point I was doing, because of coming from this place of being like doing self-publications and records and comic books, and then saying like, okay, I'm going to go to an actual art school because this will give me a space where I can do this full time. And there were some different possibilities in the city back then than there was now, and I went to the Fri Ungdomsuddannelse and ended up in Germany on this like weird coincidence where they closed down the education the week that I got into it. And you had a guidance counselor where you had to plan 3 years of your life, and you're like 16 and standing there and having to figure out, like, what are you going to do for the next 3 years, which is...
Right, where am I going to get beer tonight is more what you're thinking.
Yeah, I wasn't really there, like, as much. I was quite, like, organized in general, and I think that I got that from that environment, because you had to be organized, or... because nobody else was organizing stuff for you, so you had to figure it out to do it yourself. But then the guy was telling me, okay, if you want to get out of the country, within this form of education, you need to be connected to an official school, and you need to tell me by Tuesday. And by then, it was Thursday.
Wow.
So I had to call around and ask, okay, who do I know? And I knew this girl through the punk environment as well, that went to an academy in Bremen in Germany, and called her and was like, can I be a guest student? And she was like, I don't know. You can come to a meeting tomorrow. So I went to Germany, went to that meeting at the class, and they were like, yeah, you can be a student steward. Went back on Monday to the guidance counselor and was like, I'm going to Bremen for a year.
Wow.
and
this was like you said it was a free youth education. Was this like a kind of thing they had for people who had fallen out of the traditional university path? With
people
Denmark
would not fit into. You have this idea, like these 3 years, which is in Denmark is called the gymnasium, which is after your normal.
It's essentially high school, but it's a little more advanced.
Yeah, kind of.
It's the university track.
Yeah, it's the where you go if you want to go anywhere to university, and then they had this structure which was also 3 years, which counted for the same sort of on paper, but where you could do all sorts of other things. You could do own projects, you could do internships, or you could do all sorts of things, but you had to be, for a certain amount of hours, connected to an official institution.
Right.
So, for example, I had an internship at this space where they make comic books, where people who work with comics or illustration in Denmark are sitting, but at the same time I was taking psychology classes at the local gymnasium, or HF, together with my friend who was in jail, who could get out if he took classes. So it was actually taking psychology classes to hang out with my friend who was in jail.
Right.
That's a great I passed, but very poorly.
Right. But you started to get a feeling for, moving onwards, or like engaging with some other level.
Yeah. Definitely.
And so you went to Germany, and then what?
Then I went to Germany for that 1 year, which was the finish of that education. Then I applied during the normal command structure of the art academy and decided to stay there. And I mean, you could probably have found cities that had better academies than Bremen. It's a strange, like, North German small town. It's bigger than Aarhus, smaller than Copenhagen. It's Germany's smallest city-state. So it's in the state called Niedersachsen. They've been broke since medieval times. They're built traditionally around steelworks and universities, so it's traditionally like a red town.
Right.
A broken red town, which makes that a kind of interesting space to be in as well.
Right.
A lot of nearly all the industry is dismantled and moved to Hamburg. And there's still the huge universities, so it's a very young town as well.
Right.
And so it was good. It was a really good place to be in, because because of it being kind of small, it was easy to travel between environments, to sort of say, okay, I'm hanging out with the kids who do graffiti, but I'm also hanging out with the kids who organize punk concerts, and I'm also hanging out with the people who do like dubstep.
Right, and you can start kind of sampling
rave things, or
just trying things out and seeing where you fit in and what your role might be, etc. So, but they had an art academy there.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy that?
I did. On the overall, I did. I spent a lot of time trying to not be in the art academy, which was kind of silly because I went there to go there. But like,
it's so weird. Art school is such this thing where you're like, you know in your heart that it's fucked up and useless, that art, you know, but at the same time it's really important because it's pretend art world.
Yeah.
You know, you get an idea for some sort of like the way structures work, the language, you know, the way people talk about things, work practice, all that stuff. At the same time, you're like, you can't teach art.
Yeah.
It's bullshit. Art is play, you know, like.
Yeah. I think that was a lot of my attitude, but at the same time, there was a lot of good things in that the German system is more structured than the Danish, so the education itself has more of an academic streak in the way that you, like everything from the language to the fact that you, like the way you approach your professors or what you have to call them, or it's more structured and rich in that
like
sense. You have to give in more like
university.
theoretical papers and get what do you say, like approved marks or whatever than you have to do here.
It seems loose as shit here.
Yeah, kind of on off. They have to, like, it's been tightened a lot due to these like Bologna EU models that are being pulled down over all the different educations, but it is relatively loose. But
you've probably functioned better than working on an academic level. I mean, you like reading, you like engaging on that level.
Yeah, and it was definitely interesting getting that part as well, and saying like not just being thrown into a studio saying like, oh, you're studying free arts, do whatever you please. And because you had so much trying to fit into the institution, trying to figure out an identity within that, and saying like, okay, I'm a student of art, what the fuck does that mean? And there, I think it was really good that I already sort of had a project. I wanted to work in public space, and I wanted to do something with the city, and I was drawing and wanted to work with that, and we're doing like starting to organize exhibitions in abandoned stores or in community spaces and working on the street and
so
doing all
you
these things.
already knew what you were interested in.
Exactly, but that also meant that in the start I was a bit like, I can use the institution for what exactly? And because I wanted to be somewhere else outside the institution. I didn't even want to have a studio space in there, so I had a studio space somewhere else in a community house.
Fuck you kind of thing?
Kind of. And then in the last couple of years of the education, I really figured out that I missed the chance to have this like fantastic playground that it is being in this bubble of art school where you can do whatever, you can fuck up as much as you want and
you don't
experiment, and you don't have to, and then suddenly you're like, boom, out in the real world where you
get a job, you bum.
Sense. Exactly.
Right, I mean that's the tough reality, and I kind of wish. I mean, I feel like if I would have been older, I would have used art school much more effectively.
Yeah.
Because at the time you feel free anyways. Yeah. So you don't appreciate the freedom that it has. You know, now to have 4 years with no financial concerns whatsoever to make art in all the time, like, oh my God, you know, like that would be the most amazing thing ever. Yeah. But I guess it's the nature of the beast too, is that you have to learn the hard way.
And all the questions of also that, like, what education is, because all the things that I was doing outside of art school that was connected to being in that place, being like organizing things or being active in different spaces or playing in bands or whatever, like it all had to do with that education of being like, what do you do as an artist? Because this idea of being an artist that goes to the studio, produce something like whatever, an object, and hand it over to a gallerist that then sells it, and then you go back to your studio, and it's not, that doesn't exist. Like, it would perhaps exist for some people, but my reality is way more patchwork of doing a lot of different things that are all sort of connected to the fact that I'm making art as a professional career.
Do you? I mean, it sounds like you were early. You knew what you were interested in very early, and it's very much related to the rest of your life in terms of, you know, being in a band, making a zine, engaging with the city. All these things is also related to what you're interested in art, which is, you know, these human spaces, and, you know, getting back to that. Can you see a root in that interest before, or do you think it really does come from being involved in the anarchist left-wing do-it-yourself?
I think that was definitely a very important piece in it, but I think that, like, as we started out with saying what my parents do, then retrospectively I can see that it comes from upbringing as well, from being pointed in a certain directions, or being handed certain advice or literature or whatever, like certain possibilities or opportunities within that.
Were you very aware what your mother did?
When I got involved in sort of like the post-squatter environment in Copenhagen, I was very aware, and we argued a lot. It's because just sitting and doing these like the last case of what do you call like urban sanitation projects, where they were doing the urban renewal things in the festival, and we were very disagreeing on the point of that, and I was very non-aware of what urban planning actually was. I think I'm a little more differentiated.
Right, and also where it comes from, what ideas lies behind it. You know, because now it's kind of new and exciting, and there's stuff happening. But at one point, it was as functional as it can get.
Yeah. And particularly in Copenhagen.
It's just like you were saying about those areas. Where like, here's your apartment, here's the shop, here's the train, there's your pizza place. Shut up, go to work. You know, and like that just doesn't. We can clearly see what a failure that idea is.
I mean, they're still building that. They're still like we have a prime example in Ørestaden. Like all the people who are really like heavyweights involved in urban planning, they can say like this is the prime example of how not to plan. It's the Brazilian model. Right.
Right. And Brazil is the prime example of how
like the most also glorified example of utter failure in urban planning. And then they're building Nordhavn, and they have fixed the scales a bit. It looks like the buildings are smaller, they're a bit closer together. They've learned something from Ørestaden, but they're still building this humongous area for people who have money. Right. It's taking up the entire harbor front, and a very, very important part of the city as well. Like cleaning out the old industry that does something as well. So a shift in the identity of a city, going from being like a production to a consumer city, and like still in that process. This is the old heavyweight industrial harbor for the city. Yeah. And now it's going to be like entrance for cruise ship, and then all these planned condo apartments and whatnot. And they're building, I think the fact that they're building a huge area at once, which is then going to be finished in 2020 or something like that. Right. But which in my eyes look like they're basically repeating Ørestaden in all the wrong ways. Right, and just to contextualize, Ørestaden is an area in South Copenhagen, which was kind of, it used to be a military area. They opened it up, and they were like, we're going to build a bunch of stuff, a couple of green areas, a bunch of expensive apartments. It's essentially what the 70s were for working class, but this time it's for a more moneyed during the 90s, so it was also doing a growth, like they were starting to do that. Right, when everyone thought there would be upper middle class, you know. And there would only be like a city of upper middle class, which is also, that's an interesting ideological question of how urban planning serves the fact of how we perceive our cities or our communities or in what we build. So it's usually a good pointer to that. And it's interesting to see that they're like reconstructing the whole harbor front, for example, around Borken was the same. The whole like Nordhavn right now. It's better because it's more directly connected to the actual city, which Ørestaden is sort of an island, which also means that it completely dysfunctioned because people go there to go home and not it's kind of a ghost town in a weird way. Complete ghost town. A steel and glass ghost town. Yeah. But that's ideologically, that's the way that we're going. Like, and I'm not saying this because there's a bunch of like evil urban planners or evil-minded architects that have this like idea of this is where we want to go in these types of cities that I find extremely alienating. And that when we look at all sorts of tests, are the things that are held forth as bad examples. Like whenever just the things that are held forth are good examples of things like Nørreport, which is relatively like at once like homogeneous and heterogeneous space with a lot of old architecture integrated with new architecture, with green areas, recreative areas, with different social classes, different ethnic backgrounds. Yeah. In one big mashup. Right. And it's all very differentiated, like from house to house simply. Right. And those are the things that whenever people who work within urban planning come and have to look at Copenhagen, they go to these areas and they're like, this is functional, this is how you would want a city to be. And it's not what's being built. But I think it's mainly that the architectural professions are in the hand of like this bizarre fascination with progress that we have, like the progress of progress. And this idea of general like capital maximation and this ideological questions that are in the connotation of that, and then the whole aesthetic spectrum of being like this post-functionalist computer-generated program. Well, it's weird because it's like the idea hasn't changed since the 30s.
The fuck's that Ayn Rand book? The one everyone uses is like they laughing at what it was.
And Atlas Shrugged.
Atlas Shrugged, that's right. Where it's like
her and Elwyn Hubbard are possibly like the most scariest science fiction authors that exist because their sci-fi is directly applicated into real life.
Right, and it's moral.
Yeah, and she's like, oh my God, the neoliberalist like icon of.
Right. Pull yourself together or fucking forget it.
But her vision of the future exists very much now.
Right, well, I mean, it seems those ideals are kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But let's play a game here. Eurostat is an empty green area.
Yeah.
Nothing's there. Mm-hmm. And the powers that be come to you and say, do it, build it. What would you do? What would you do differently, I guess, is the question. How would you build that neighborhood of Copenhagen? Like, what would you do differently about it?
That becomes a difficult question because then I have to like either give you a sort of rhetorical answer or go into this more like.
Well, I guess more the question is like, what did they do wrong? You know, because they did. I mean, it's nice. It's pretty in a lot of ways. There's really nice green areas and stuff.
The architecture is also extremely pretty. There's some really, really interesting things. But the fact is that it's not like. I don't think that it will ever be a functional community, and it will take such a long time for it to be a functional community.
Do you think the problem is because there is very little third space? There's very little culture. It's homes. There's some work, but there's very little shops. There's very little cafes. And
it's, for example, there's like, and then there's the concrete problems with, for example, with doing the cafes is that they build the roads too big. There's no like shelter visually or for wind. And it's one big wind tunnel. It's very windy out there. Like it's a windy country. We have 7 days a year when there's no wind in Denmark on Sjælland in general. Like, but so building something that functions as a wind tunnel is not a very good idea for making cafes or for building recreative areas.
Right.
And for example, Ammerstrandparken and all these things are huge like recreative areas, but a lot of people use them.
Right, that's a success.
It's a complete success, and it's really important to have that open space in the city. And I mean, we have the problem we're running out of space. We have to build out. Part of Nordhavn is going to float because we don't have more space to build on. Like we're on an island. But so there's a whole area of where you could give like concrete examples of where I think they went wrong in terms of the scale and the architecture and the demography out there. But I think it's more maybe perhaps interesting to say like, okay, why are we building in that sense? Why are we attracted to building in that sense and continuing down that path in terms of making architecture that reflects that kind of ideology? Like
I know why. Money.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what we're ending up with again, and that's I think is why I'm anti that. Like,
right, and so the problem is at the foundation of it.
Yeah.
That you know they're like, okay, you know the city, let's say, has an idea. We're going to build this out. Who's going to pay for it?
The economic liberal decision in that ideology of like of cash.
Right. Well, okay.
And progress because
how
those
does
things
this
are connected?
Right. How does this all tie back into your work? We got to talk about your work at some point.
This all ties back into my work. This is all.
These are the ideas you're wrestling with.
Yeah, a lot of the ideas that I'm wrestling with now is concerned with like this somewhere between like space and place, and it's probably the end that I'm interested in. It's the movement between like space and place, which is something that is existing as perhaps as time. And that way also relating to community, because community is not something as much existing in time as a structure of things, rather it is a thing that times itself.
Right.
And it's something that exists as a movement, or as we were talking about before, when it solidifies, it stagnates and becomes rigid, and my eyes starts developing like problems in that sense.
Right.
Well, community is problems. They're two always also connected.
People are problems.
But so right now I'm doing different types of work that sort of tries to approach like architecture, but from an outside the discourse perspective. I'm of course within a discourse of an actual discourse of urban planning, but since working with art and not with urban planning, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an architect, I'm not an urban planner, then I'm not giving as much like concrete answers, thereby also not wanting to answer that question of how can we build a better city?
Right.
Because I'm not sure I know. Like, I think it's very important still to hold that utopian idea of like something better, something that lies constantly in the future. In that sense, like architecture itself is probably always an utopian endeavor, because the architect, when envisioning a product, is envisioning this product in a future, because it's something that is to be built whenever presenting a project. And I guess that the architect would always think that this would be a better future, in some sense, partly because of this product that they're doing. So it's not the architect that I'm after here, it's more perhaps our relation between like architecture and something we could define as a social, like a collective subconscious, in terms of like how these subconscious desires and anxieties that are projected and introjected through the environment that we are in, through our built environment, our physical surroundings, and how we reflect back and forth with our physical surroundings, like this subconscious that we share. So it's a way of approaching like why is society the way it is, and what else could it be, and where is it going. And
well, what about the dystopian element? Because you have a very heavy dystopian and even sometimes science fiction element to your work. You're not showing utopian cities.
It's a near future science fiction. When in terms of discussing Ballard, as the last exhibition was based on one of his novels. Yeah, he's using this term of like the future in 5 minutes. Of this, we're not talking spaceships. We're not talking different planets. Here it's like the subconscious self that is the alien world that we're exploring, and we're exploring our immediate realities, but through the optical scope of sci-fi. And I think that sci-fi has an interesting vocabulary, because it can sort of do a cognitive estrangement of our immediate surroundings, of that neon light, or that like dead angle of the wall down there, or of the way the bus drives on the street, or whatever. Like if we look through the escalators, the social interaction down there on the benches, and looking at that and saying like, okay, not just extrapolating and saying, okay, if this continues the same way, then we are always going to end up with dystopia. But also being able to ask the questions of like, what if it was different? What if we could do this and this? What if the society looks like that? What if there was a different gender type? What if there was I think that's why sci-fi is interesting. And I think it's interesting to explore those like dystopian aspects of it, because I feel in a lot of sense that's where we're heading. And it's only a couple of steps away before we're there. So to explore like the ground where we are at now, I feel that it's interesting to sort of you could say maybe it's to say that to invert the geologist maxim of that the key to the present lies in the past, and rather say the key to the present lies in the future.
Although that's infinitely discussable.
It is.
As a subject. But I mean, do you struggle with, because you're clearly very well thought, you have a lot of ideas, you know what you're doing. Do you struggle to visualize, to make visual these ideas? Because that's the part that's so tough for me about academic work. And I'm not necessarily calling your work academic, but I'm just talking about like making ideas reality, and artwork is, essentially visual. And I'm not working from a particularly conceptual approach. There's like a balance between like a formal and conceptual approach in the things I'm making, because I'm making visual products. And it's aesthetic.
It's very aesthetic. I think the aesthetic part is a really important vehicle for discussing these ideas or thoughts or whatever, like to have that common ground with somebody, and a personal external from yourself, or another gaze, to engage with not just like the aesthetic surface of something, but with why is it this way.
But why not write an essay then? That's the whole thing. That's the hard thing for me is, and I guess that's also what a stroke of genius is in terms of making artworks. Like for me, one of the prime examples for me of why art can represent ideas beautifully is someone like Felix Gonzalez Torres. Who can put a pile of candy in the corner of a gallery which weighs the same amount as his dead lover, and invite the audience to take this candy and eat it. It's so emotional and evocative, and the idea melds so perfectly with the aesthetics. And that's the challenge, right? I'm not good enough to do that. I can't, sometimes I can't even imagine it. I can just sometimes taste it. Do you know what I mean? When you get this, like, your brain is like, and you're like, I can almost taste what would be perfect to do here, but it's not, it doesn't ever manifest itself. You know, I mean, are you essentially frustrated by your works because they're not engaging enough, or is it more just constantly a step forward in the right direction?
I think there is a constant level of frustration to doing almost anything, but particularly to doing art. And it's like this interesting part about like crisis. Like you're constantly in a state of crisis, and the what's it called? Like the etymological background of the word crisis is the same as critique.
Right.
You're constantly in this negotiating, like, why is it this way? Why am I doing that? And I've been spending a lot of time on discarding a certain formal approach to work, like been simply burning down the back catalog of saying, okay, I've been doing this for so and so long, now I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to uproot what I've been doing, and doing it quite regularly, and saying, okay, now I'm going to change my approach to this.
Kill your babies.
Yeah. But also, it's more, not as much as a kill your darling strategy, more to, in a certain way of figuring out, okay, I'm remotely good at this, what else could we try out? But just as much also in trying to find a visual language that is adequate for expressing, like, a sort of a thought structure or a base of ideas around that. But those things are in a continuous dialogue with each other as well. Of like, because why not write an essay? Yes, because I'm not in that department where I would want to write an essay, because I'm not sure an essay would adequately express what I'm going for, what I desire to make,
it's
to put into
not
the
a better
world.
tool.
And there's people out there who are way better at writing essays than me.
Right.
Not because you have to be the best, but I just think that I could get something more sensible out of writing an essay and then using that to make a picture.
Right.
Or a series of pictures, because I rarely make one picture. Everything is always happening like in context of something else, as a spin-off of another picture, of a dialogue, of another work.
Right.
So in that way, it's also this continuous production of things that sort of are, for myself, a negotiation of why making things. And
right. Do you feel like you are, I mean, you talk about the present serving the future serving the present. In terms of your work, are you headed, do you know where you're going?
I'm going back outside of the gallery spaces, and outside of the institutional spaces, because that was sort of where I started out, and I spent a lot of time trying to distance myself from what became scene, this idea of like the street art scene or whatever that was, and I really wanted to get away from that, because I felt it was just stagnating and being horribly commodified again. Right,
and now it's starting to re-evolve again.
Not as much that, but I just feel that I've been continuously wanting to work with like the outdoors environment, with stuff that is not happening inside the gallery space, and there I think it just makes more sense to go back out there. And I've been wanting a lot to work with things that relates to urban planning. In that sense, I'm actually making a project about like fringe planning right now, which
like
is
more concrete,
very concrete project that will start out this summer and will probably run for some time, but which is about like, it's kind of like anti-planning, you would say. It borrows certain things from the urban planning discourse, but it's more about like, why not plan, or where does the plan malfunctions, and why is that an interesting
Would
place?
It be better? Not
necessarily better, but just what are the spaces that malfunction then? Like both the built environment that malfunction, but also the gaps in the city that are sort of beyond where the identity has shifted, like the ruinous space or the vague terrain, or like those spaces that fall outside of the general stringent schema of the planning, and all those like holes that happen in this homogeneous surface of a city like this, then to use these again to sort of as gateways into this collective subconscious and trying to negotiate that. So it's still a discussion about like why society the way society is, or why am I functioning this way, or why are you functioning this way, but looking at a scale that is like our infrastructural scale of those functions.
Well, it seems to me like it would be a natural step or an interesting step to ally yourself on some level with actual urban planning. There is either legitimate or non-legitimate, you know.
I'm part of a seminar this May, which is called Metropolis Laboratory, that they have every second year. Part of the Metropolis Festival that is then every other second year, where they put together architects, sociologists, artists, urban planners, theater people, and sort of presents different types of work. And this year I'm doing sort of a scale model, but in actual size of a project that is then going to be done in 2015 for Metropolis, and holding this type of like pseudo lecture on the project, which is about something else.
Cool. When is that, you say?
It's end of May. I think it's the 21st to 23rd. I think.
How can people come see that if they want to?
I think it's an open event. I think I'm scheduled for doing something on the 21st on Reftalerøen at 10 in the morning.
Okay. Is there a website?
There is a website. It's called KIT, Københavns Internationale Teater. Those are the people organizing it. Okay. But it's called Metropolis Laboratory.
Okay. KIT is organizing it. It's called Metropolis Laboratory. Yeah. Kind of as a final thing, I'm curious also, if you're moving outside of the gallery and you know, obviously you're working kind of on the edges of established art world. How do you make it work financially? How do you survive?
I don't necessarily think I'm working on the edges of established artwork. I think that I'm using part of the infrastructure of the art world, or using that infrastructure as well, and contributing to it, and being in general a part of it, and I find it just as interesting to work within the museum or the gallery as I find it outside. It's just different problems, and I think the problems I'm concerned with are outside of those institutions, so therefore it makes more sense to be out there.
Right.
But one is not necessarily better than the other. That's not what I'm going at. But for how I'm making it work financially is, again, it's patchwork economy.
Right. Do you have a job?
No, I do this full time, but very patchworky.
Right. Well, it's living the dream, right? I mean,
yeah. I don't know if that was a dream. I guess it was. There's this scary independency.
Well, it's a dream if you have a job.
Yeah.
If you have a job.
If you have a money job that you have to next to it. It depends, of course, like what you do. I've been discussing that with Jacob as well. Like this, do you then want a money job that's completely unrelated to what you do, because that's what you do.
Right.
But at the same time, I find it interesting to go to other cities. For example, I was in New York in end of last year because I was doing an exhibition over there, and talking to a bunch of people where the most common thing is people go like, so what do you do? Oh, well, I'm a writer, or I'm a theater performer, and then besides from that, I'm also like selling coffee, and I'm taking photocopies, or I'm a portier, or whatever, like doing these 5 other things, but what I do is this. Right. And the question that we in society have of you are what you work with. Right. So when people ask, what do you do? They're meaning, what do you work with? Not necessarily, what do you do? Right. You could give them so many other different answers of like, I take strolls. Right. I am a bicyclist.
I pet kitties.
Exactly. I am a father, or I am whatever. It's something that is not inside of the job market.
Well, this is the problem I have, essentially. I can't make enough money to not work, but, I don't have enough time to really get a lot of my own work done.
Catch-22 did a lot of...
Exactly. But, and I guess Jacob's probably in the same situation or similar. Yeah. And what you were asking about whether you should work in your field or not in your field, and my answer has been to work tangentially to your field. Yeah. I mostly do photography, so therefore being a framer I don't have to do photography at work. Yeah. But it's related to it in a way. It's related to artwork. Yeah. So I can leave my job there, but it's also related. I think part of the reason we started this program is because we, for me personally, I'm engaged with a lot of artists constantly. And I like talking to artists, and I like seeing what they do and asking about it. For me, it's just as interesting to see the work and the artist and then talk to the artist directly about the work than it is to come to a museum and see something hanging on the wall and have to come at it completely on my own.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it goes both ways. I was talking to another photographer the other day who was like, he had been doing for a long time retouching as a money job, and now he was saying like, I can't do that anymore. I need to be a waiter or bartender, whatever, because I cannot work with other people's pictures in this way and invest so much time in that. But I think it's also perhaps different from the structure that you seem to have in that frame shop specifically, because it's all people that are related to the field and have a lot of respect for each other's actual doings,
right.
And say, okay, we all work here and there's a certain community around that, and we're doing frames, and we put an intense amount of pride into doing a very good frame. It's interesting seeing all of you in that exhibition of Jacob's, where suddenly the discussion of the actual art was away and everybody was piling up and looking at this tiny split in the frame and going like, have you noticed that? Yeah, I did notice that. I noticed that instantly. And it was the moment that the framers walked in, and that was for me very interesting as well, because that also is it's trade talk, it's shop talk, it's very important, but the same sense that I've just been talking about something completely different concerning that exact picture with Jacob just a moment before.
Right.
And then here's another level of it, but a frame is also a very valuable discussion on a very different levels, but on a craftsmanship level, I think it was so nice to see that these all like artists who work in the frame shop who also have this craftsman's pride in doing the proper frame.
Right. Well, you have to, believe in what you do to some level, and that's why I choose that job. I could probably get a pretty good job as a secretary somewhere and work part-time and make okay money, but I wouldn't be able to engage with it on some level, know. But it is actually a problem not being able to see the artwork for the frame. Because, it's starting to happen that I'm like, oh, that's nice. Oh, that corner's not joined,
But that is an interesting discussion, because that leads to the what the whole infrastructure is, what the gallery is, what the museum is.
Right,
because
right.
is just what the mantra is. It's just an extension of that framing of the objects.
Right, and then this will be a 3-hour program. To get into that. But yeah, I guess we should start wrapping it up.
Yeah, let's.
Do you have any kind of final words on where you are right now and what's going on, what's coming up?
Right now, I'm that's a difficult one. I'm making collages today. I'm reading Hakim Bey on temporary autonomous zones and poetic terrorism, and I'm making collages. That's what I'm doing for the rest of the day. Poetic terrorism. Yeah. That's epic. And looking for a new studio. He's interesting. He's into this like ontological anarchism and mysticism, like post-mysticism. Kind of the yippie 70s American movement. It's really freaky shit, but it's really interesting. And I'm looking for a new studio, yeah. Do you ever have brain overload on this sort of stuff? Completely. But then I have a most fantastic 2-year-old daughter, and then we read children's books, or just poke at the ground with a stick, or play with the chickens in the Gamles By. Right. So. Yeah, it's actually a really good grounding. Yeah, it is. Grounding thing to do. I guess you read science fiction too. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a relaxing thing for me sometimes. I know, but it's also a work thing. Because then I read science fiction that are related to me. I'm reading Concrete Island by Ballard right now. And it's horrible because it continues to relate to this project. And then it's like, oh, I need to have another escapement. I guess you'll have to read something with unicorns and... Yeah, but then I watch series. That's my sort of other vent. Right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the program. Thanks so much for having me. It was a joy. All right, you guys see what I mean? The guy really is just super engaged, and it's inspiring, and it makes me want to read those crazy books he reads. So, one of the things I really enjoyed about the talk was when we talked about why make art. When one is talented and engaged and has heart and cares, why make art and not social work or anything else? And this is a really interesting question. I really enjoyed the way he answered it. And I don't think there is a pure answer. It's just an answer you have to find on your own, essentially. But this theme is going to be a great introduction into next week. Next week's guest is a talented artist who retired from the art world. And that's something I find fascinating. Someone who's really good at what they do, who decides to bow out and do something else. And, she asked the question about why make art and came to her own conclusion. So next week's talk is really good. I'm not going to tell you guys who it is. It's a little foreshadowing on my part, but you guys can look forward to that. And it's kind of central to this theme about why make art. And during the week here, if you guys also think this is interesting, please get a hold of us, write us, take part on Twitter, website, all of that.
So that's about going to do it for this week. If you like the show, please tell a friend, and please reach out. You can find us on the web, undergang.net. You can find us on Twitter, the Undergang, and you can email me, Ando, ANDO, at undergang.net if you have any questions, any comments about the show, or any comments about the topic. And that's about it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. We're moving forward. And remember, it's hard to be good, so instead we just try to get better. This week's show brought to you by the Undergang once again. Intro and outro music provided by Heavy Links. You can catch a link to Heavy Links on our About page. And the interstitial music today provided by Broke for Free. What do you guys think about that? Catch us on the web. Catch us next week, Wednesday mornings, the Undergang Armchair. Thank you so much for joining us. Talk to you next week.